Hello and welcome everybody to our first online lecture from MultiscaleConsulting. Contact mechanics and rubber friction are both very complicated topics for various reasons. We at MultiscaleConsulting have been working on these problems for many years now, and these lectures present some of the most important results of our studies. In this first lecture, we are going to introduce you to the topic and we will discuss the importance of surface roughness and learn how to characterize it. The next online lectures will then focus on contact mechanics and rubber friction. If you are interested in these topics, you may also find more material on our homepage MultiscaleConsulting.com. This first slide illustrates the importance of surfaces in our everyday life. They actually play a major role as our life takes place on a surface, namely the surface of the Earth, and not inside the Earth. Photosynthesis of plants occurs on the surface or in a very thin layer on the leaves of every plant. Even when we use our brain to think about something, we are basically using only a very thin layer on top of the surface of our brain. Surfaces and their interactions with each other are also of huge importance for many technological applications. One example may be wiper blades on a car used to remove water from the windshield. Another application we are working on at the moment are syringes, where we are interested in friction and leakage between the rubber plug and the barrel. And of course, tires, both on dry and wet road surfaces. All these different applications involve contact mechanics, and they are influenced by surface interactions between the two solids. Understanding these interactions is a very demanding task, which was also addressed by Wolfgang Pauli, who received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1945. He said that God made the bulk, but surfaces were invented by the devil. This in a very beautiful way illustrates that working with surfaces can be a very demanding problem. The problem with surfaces and what makes them so very complicated is that they are not smooth, but that they are rough. And not only that, to make things even more complicated, they have roughness on different length scales. Let's see what that actually means. When we look, for example, at the balls from this ball bearing or the cylinder surface, they look perfectly smooth to the naked eye as illustrated in the figure in the lower left corner. We cannot observe any surface roughness. But when we start to magnify into one region of the ball, for example using an optical microscope, one will at some magnification start to observe surface roughness. But not enough. If we now look closer at one of these asperities, which appears smooth at the given magnification, after increasing the magnification even more, one will observe additional roughness at this even smaller length scale. So we have additional, smaller scale or micro roughness on top of the macro roughness. This procedure can now be repeated even further, and it usually continues all the way to atomic distances. In some applications, for example a road surface, one can observe surface roughness starting at millimeter or centimeter size all the way down to nanometer scale roughness components. This means one may have to include up to 7 decades in length scale or surface roughness in the contact mechanics study. Let us now try to understand what we actually mean when we talk about contact mechanics. In the context of contact mechanics, we try to study the deformation of two solids which are squeezed into contact so that they touch each other at one or more points. Because of surface roughness, this becomes a tough problem, as you can already see from this figure. Usually one studies an elastic solid with a smooth surface, for example a rubber block, squeezed into contact with a rigid solid with surface roughness. This rigid solid could be, for example, a road surface. The basic problems that we want to understand in contact mechanics are the following. You can see that because of roughness the contact area is not complete, but that the two solids touch each other only on top of some high asperities. In this context, one of the most important questions is how big is the area of real contact. This is of great importance for many different applications in nature and technology. Another important quantity is the average interfacial separation between the two solids. But not only the average separation, also the distribution of interfacial separations, which is of importance for the leakage of seals. And last but not least, the squeezing pressure on the rubber block is supported in the area of real contact, and one would like to understand the distribution of the contact stresses acting here. These are basically the 4 most important questions in the context of contact mechanics. We have already learned that surface roughness occurs on many different length scales, and this is also the reason why understanding contact mechanics is such a difficult problem. Let us have a look at this again, because this has direct implications for the contact mechanics between the two solids. It is crucial to understand this for the rest of our lecture. Looking at the lowest magnification, say with the naked eye, at these two solids in contact with each other, it seems as if the two bodies touch each other only on top of some high asperities. Here, the contact seems to be complete. However, when we look at one of these contact regions a little bit closer, by increasing the magnification, say using an optical microscope, we will observe additional, smaller scale roughness, and we see that what seemed to be full contact before now breaks up into smaller regions of contact and regions of non-contact. This picture now continues all the way up to the highest magnification of order atomic distances as surface roughness occurs to these length scales. Please note that only taking into account all length scales will give you the correct answer to the question how large your real area of contact is. In this context, one cannot neglect any length scale from the analysis. However, many other theories neglect this fact, and they simplify the picture by taking care of roughness only on a single or a limited number of length scales. Another reason to not neglect any length scale is that depending on the problem one is interested in, different effects can become important or manifest themselves at different length scales. This is shown in this graph where the wavelength lambda of a particular roughness component is plotted on the x-axis. With wavelength we mean the following. We model the profile of the measured surface roughness as sinusoidal waves with different wavelengths or frequencies and different amplitudes. This is called Fourier transformation and a very common approach to describe roughness, for example. Please study our lecture on Fourier transformation to learn more about this procedure. When we now speak about a certain wavelength, we basically refer to the lateral size of a single roughness component, which also defines its length scale. Below the x-axis is the magnification for the case that we define the wavelength lambda 10 to the minus 2 meter as magnification 1 or lowest resolution possible. That means that at magnification 1 we cannot observe smaller roughness components than lambda 10 to the minus 2 meter or 1 centimeter. Above the x-axis we show different material properties and at what length scale they may become important. Plastic deformations, for example, are important at length scales of order micrometer, while surface layering appears at much smaller length scales or higher magnification if you want. We also see that specific length scales dominate certain physical quantities, while others can be neglected. Contact resistance and contact stiffness are dominated by surface roughness with wavelength of order of 10 to 100 micrometer. The leakage of a static seal, on the other hand, is typically affected by roughness component at length scales of order micrometer. However, this is only a rough estimate, and we want to remember you again that it is of huge importance to not exclude any length scale from the problem you are trying to solve without knowing its influence. If you want to understand rubber friction or adhesion, you may need to include all surface roughness information. For road surfaces, this implies including surface roughness starting at centimeter up to atomic resolution. To approach the problems in contact mechanics, first thing to do is that we need to have a good description of the roughness. As we have learned now, it is not enough to have information about the roughness involved on a single or only over a limited range of length scales. However, commonly accepted and used roughness parameters like the root mean square roughness, the maximum peak height, or the skewness are usually dominated by certain length scales and do not contain surface roughness information over many length scales. We have found that the only proper way of addressing this problem is the surface roughness power spectrum. It comprehends basically all relevant statistical properties of a randomly rough surface. One can obtain the surface roughness power spectrum directly from any measured height profile measured over a square or even along a single line. Common ways to obtain the topography is by measuring the sample using optical methods, atomic force microscopy, or stylus instruments. When you have the height information h, which is the height away from the average plane as indicated in the figure, as a function of the lateral coordinates x and y, the power spectrum can be calculated using two different methods. One method is to take the two-dimensional Fourier transform of the height profile and then take the square of that. Another way would be to take the two-dimensional Fourier transformation of the height-height correlation function. The Fourier transform basically transforms the height information as a function of coordinate into a new function with frequency or wave vector as argument. This is done by modeling the roughness profile as a superposition of many plane waves with varying frequency and amplitude. For a better understanding of this procedure, we may ask you to have a look at our lecture on Fourier transformation or learn more about this in the literature. Many measuring techniques measure the height information only along a single line. However, if the surface exhibits isotropic roughness, one can calculate the one-dimensional power spectrum from the measured profile and use the formula given in the bottom of this slide to calculate the two-dimensional power spectrum from the one-dimensional. Before having a look at the power spectrum of a real surface, we first consider fractal surfaces. A fractal surface is a surface that, if you magnify a region of it, still looks statistically the same compared to the surface before magnifying it. This is illustrated in the figure in the upper left corner, where a change in the magnification from 10 to 100 seems not to change the roughness profile. However, most surfaces are not fractal, they are self-affine fractal. A self-affine fractal is basically very similar to a fractal surface, but when you magnify a region of it, you will need to magnify or scale the horizontal direction with a different factor than in the vertical direction to have the magnified surface roughness looking the same as compared to before magnifying it. This is illustrated in the expression in the middle of this slide. If we scale the x and the y coordinate with the magnification zeta, we will have to multiply the height with zeta to the power of some constant factor h. This factor is called the Hurst exponent and gives information on how roughness changes with increasing magnification. If h is 1, the magnification is the same in all directions, meaning that the surface is fractal. This is illustrated schematically in the lower left figure, showing that a fractal surface looks the same when scaling all directions with zeta as shown in the left. However, when h is different from 1, it is called a self-affine fractal surface. Scaling a self-affine fractal surface with a constant factor zeta in all directions, including the height h, the magnified region appears to be much rougher. Notice that h has to be a number between 0 and 1. Let's have a look now at the surface roughness power spectrum of a self-affine fractal surface. In the graph on the right, we have plotted the logarithm of the power spectrum on the y-axis as a function of the logarithm of the wave vector q. Remember, the wave vector q here is 2 pi divided by the wavelength lambda of the sinusoidal wave that has been fitted in the Fourier transformation in order to imitate the measured surface roughness topography. In case the surface is a self-affine fractal, it means that plotting the power spectrum will give a straight line. This means that there is a power relation between the power spectrum c and the wave vector q as shown in the formula in the bottom. This power relation is basically described by the Hurst exponent h and illustrates the fractal nature of surface roughness. To summarize this, the power spectrum gives you information how the height of the sinusoidal waves decreases with increasing wave vector or decreasing wavelength of the different roughness components. It therefore contains information about all length scales used in the calculation of it. From the slope of the power spectrum between the long-distance roll-off wave vector q0 and the short-distance cutoff wave vector q1, one can directly calculate the Hurst exponent. Knowing the Hurst exponent, we can also calculate another important quantity, which is the fractal dimension. The fractal dimension is simply 3 minus the Hurst exponent. Because of that, the fractal dimension will be between 3 and 2. In addition to this self-affine fractal behavior, shown as straight line from QR up to Q1, one can usually observe a plateau region at smaller wave vectors or larger wavelength. This basically means that the lateral size of the measured topography is larger than the longest or biggest roughness component of the surface. Therefore, no additional surface roughness at length scales smaller than QR occurs. Q0 here is basically 2 pi divided by the lateral size of your topography measurement. Knowing the surface roughness power spectrum, you can calculate almost anything you want. The only constraint is that the surface has to be randomly rough and isotropic, but this is basically true for most surfaces in nature and technology. Under these conditions, all the information are still included in the power spectrum. For example, an integral over the power spectrum as indicated in the first equation on this slide will give you the mean squared roughness parameter RQ. Taking the root of this value results in the RMS roughness parameter. Also, the mean square surface slope can be written as an integral over the power spectrum as shown in the second equation. To conclude this again, if you have the power spectrum of a randomly rough surface, you have all statistical properties and information about your surface. There is nothing else to be learned. In case for a non-randomly rough surface, you would need also higher order correlation functions to fully characterize the statistical properties of a surface. However, many surfaces in nature and technology are basically randomly rough and can therefore be fully characterized by the surface roughness power spectrum. Let us now have a look on some calculated surface roughness power spectra for real surfaces. All the results shown here have actually been calculated from measured topographies. The power spectrum is always plotted in the same way. We show the power spectrum on the y-axis as a function of the wave vector q on the x-axis. Both axes are on a log scale. In the upper left figure, we find the power spectra of two different asphalt road surfaces showing a beautiful linear relation from wave vectors 10 to the 3 up to 10 to the 5. One can also see a roll-off region starting at around q equals 1000, which actually corresponds to a wavelength of order a couple of millimeters. The lower left figure shows a number of power spectra measured on the human skin at the inner side of the forearm. And on the lower right side, we find different power spectra measured on the tacky side of a piece of scotch tape after pulling it off from a substrate. This results in a randomly rough polymer surface with very different roughness for each prepared sample. This is actually also the reason why there is so much spread in the experimental results. Let's now focus on the figure in the upper right corner, where we see the power spectrum of a grinded steel surface. Here we have studied the surface using different measurement techniques. The red and the green curves have been obtained from stylus measurements. They give information about microscopic roughness components of the surface, while the atomic force microscope results cover the intermediate length scales. Finally, the pink curve covers the smallest length scales measured in this study. Using different techniques, one can cover more decades in length scales. Comparing the graph on the left that covers basically 2.5 decades, the figure on the right covers 5 decades, starting at millimeter roughness, going all the way to nanometers. One can also see that the different power spectra join smoothly in the regions where they overlap. This is a very good test to check how well the different techniques perform against each other by checking how good the curves overlap with each other. Let's look again at the asphalt road surface in the upper left figure. We can see that the surface 2 is rougher at small wave vectors. This means that the surface will appear rougher for the naked eye, and one may come to the conclusion that the friction of a rubber block sliding on this substrate may be higher than compared to surface 1. However, experimentally it was found that surface 1 actually gives higher rubber friction. The reason for that is that the power spectrum lies above the power spectrum of surface 2 for smaller length scales. It is rougher on the microscale, resulting in higher energy dissipation in the rubber. In addition to the power spectrum, it is sometimes also interesting to look at other quantities like the distribution of heights and the distribution of slopes. The left figure shows a calculated height probability where on the x-axis the height h away from the average plane of the surface is plotted. The y-axis shows the relative probability for the particular height deviation from the mean plane. For a randomly rough surface, this curve is a Gaussian centered at 0. One can use this curve to get information about how big fraction of a surface is below or a certain distance interval away from the mean plane. If the height probability is not symmetric around 0, this means that the surface roughness is skewed and therefore not randomly rough. In the right figure, we can see the distribution of slopes. This is basically the same as the height probability, only as a function of the local slope. We see here that most of the surface has a slope of about 0.5. From these two curves, one can directly calculate the RMS height and the RMS slope of the surface using these two integrals here. From the height distribution, we can also calculate the skewness and the kurtosis. On the next slide, we will discuss what to do if the skewness is not 0, because then the surface is not randomly rough and the power spectrum does no longer contain all information anymore. Note also that the two curves shown here will always differ a little bit from the ideal case. The height probability will usually not be exactly a Gaussian. The reason for that are finite size effects of the surface region you have measured on. Only by averaging over many measurements you will obtain a really Gaussian curve. We have developed a particular method how to take non-randomly rough surfaces that are skewed into account in an approximate way. Let us have a closer look at this sandpaper surface as shown in the upper left corner. Here we find the abrasive particles glued on some substrate using a polymer binder. This results in a combination of sharp and rough asperities pointing up, while the valleys are relatively smooth due to the smooth polymer binder. We illustrate that also in the roughness profile plotted below the surface, showing that these types of surfaces are not symmetric around the midplane. We now separate the profile by cutting it at its mean plane. Then the roughness below the average plane is replaced by some profile which has the same statistical properties as the profile above the average plane. From this new profile, we can now calculate what we call the top power spectrum. If we replace the profile above the average plane, we would refer to it as the bottom power spectrum. In the lower left figure, we can see that the height distribution of sandpaper deviates from a Gaussian. It basically extends more to larger heights. In the right figure, you can see the calculated top and bottom power spectrum of one of these sandpaper surfaces compared to the full power spectrum. We see that the top power spectrum is basically slightly larger than the full power spectrum, while the bottom power spectrum is lower and therefore smoother. This is in good agreement with our qualitative picture about sandpaper. We now take non-randomly rough surfaces approximately into account by using the top power spectrum in the contact mechanics calculations. This can also be motivated easily. When you squeeze a rubber block against a rough substrate, you will usually not form complete contact, but only be in contact on some high asperities, and therefore the roughness in the valleys is not of importance because the rubber only probes the roughness on top of the asperities. We have learned up to now that most surfaces have roughness with isotropic properties, but sometimes you will also find surfaces with anisotropic roughness. This means that the roughness looks different when one looks at the surface under different angles. This can come from the process how these surfaces are prepared. Grinding or polishing in one direction can be the origin for anisotropy. In the example we show here, the barrel of this syringe is produced by extrusion, resulting in wear scars in the actual direction of the syringe. This has great implications on the leakage of the fluid through the interface between the barrel and the rubber plug. One way to characterize the anisotropy is the Picklinic number. Let's have a look at the asperities of the rough surface. In case the roughness is isotropic, the asperities look on the average circular. This is shown in the lower figure in the middle. The Picklinic number now is simply the ratio of the diameter of these circular asperities in the x direction divided by the diameter in the y direction. In figure B, the Picklinic number is 1. However, if the asperities are elongated in one direction, the Picklinic number becomes larger or smaller than 1, indicating how much the asperities are elongated into that direction. If you're interested in fluid dynamics, there is another number which is even more important than the Picklinic number, and that is the trip number. However, one can relate them to each other, but we're not going into detail about that now. Usually one calculates the trip number from the power spectrum by relating it to the eigenvalues of the matrix shown here on the slide. This is an important number if you're interested in fluid dynamics at rough interfaces. But because we are not going to discuss fluid dynamics, we will stop here. Let's conclude our lecture now. In this first lecture on surface roughness, we have learned that basically all surfaces are rough. One just needs to look close enough at the surface. We have also learned that surface roughness does not appear only on a single length scale. It continues on all length scales until an atomic dimension is reached. We have seen that surface roughness behaves fractal-like, meaning that if one magnifies a particular region of a roughness profile, it looks statistically the same as before magnifying it. To describe this fractal nature of surface roughness, we have introduced the surface roughness power spectrum, which is basically the only way to describe this kind of roughness. If you have a randomly rough surface, all information are included in the power spectrum. There is nothing else to be learned. In case we have a surface with skewed roughness or anisotropic properties, there are other methods to take this into account, namely the top power spectrum as well as some other anisotropy parameters. The power spectrum and all other shown parameters and curves have been calculated using software that we at MultiscaleConsulting have developed in the past. If you're interested in using this software, please feel free to contact us on our homepage. Thank you for attending our first online lecture. We hope you find it interesting and useful.